Alara was 28 when her grandfather died, and her inheritance, after the good china and the timber rights and the paid-off farmhouse were carved up by her uncle, was a joke told in a sad, quiet room. It was 3 acres of exhausted bottomland known locally as the Pear Dump, a parcel the county tax assessor valued at $475. It was the place where Hemlock's orchards pushed their bruised, unsellable fruit to rot back into the earth. Her uncle Marcus, a man who measured love in closing costs, had laughed when he signed over the deed, a dry, clicking sound in his throat. "He always said you liked playing in the dirt, Ellie," he'd said, tapping the paper. "Knock yourself out." He didn't know, nobody knew, that Silas had spent 34 years hiding a cathedral in that dirt, a secret built of patience and broken things, waiting for the one person who knew how to listen for it. But that comes later. First, there was the silence after the last car left. The memorial was not a funeral. Silas had forbidden it. "Burn me, scatter me, and have a pot of coffee," his will had stated, in the same neat, methodical script he used to label his seed packets. So they gathered at the community hall, a place that smelled of stale coffee and decades of pancake breakfasts. The air was thick with polite sorrow and the cloying sweetness of store-bought sympathy casseroles. Alara sat in the front row, a small, still point in the eddy of condolences. She wore her only good dress, a plain black cotton that felt too thin for the occasion. In her pocket, her fingers worried a small, smooth riverstone, worn to a gray gleam by her grandfather's thumb. It was the only thing she had taken from his bedside table before Marcus and his wife, Cynthia, had arrived with their packing tape and their careful, acquisitive grief. Marcus stood at the podium. He was a real estate agent from the city, dressed in a suit that cost more than Alara's truck. He spoke of Silas as a charming eccentric, a man of simple tastes and rustic hobbies. "A real character," he said, smiling a practiced, professional smile. He loved this land. He loved his little projects. The word projects landed with a soft thud of dismissal, painting Silas as a puttering old man, a harmless tinkerer. Alara felt a hot spike of anger in her chest. She remembered Silas's hands, the knuckles swollen with arthritis but the fingers still impossibly deft, able to gauge the precise moment a ferment had soured into life. That was no hobby, that was a religion. The townspeople knew better. They shifted in their folding chairs. They had tasted Silas's strange, fiery vinegars, the ones he gave away in unlabeled mason jars. They had seen him haul bags of rock dust to replenish his soil, had watched him talk to his pear trees as if they were shy children. After Marcus's slick eulogy fizzled out, they came to Alara one by one. Old Mr. Hemlock, the orchard owner, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and worry, took her hand. His grip was dry and strong. "Your granddad," he said, his voice a low rumble, "could turn rot into gold. Don't let anyone tell you different." Later, by the coffee urn, Marcus cornered her. He had a sheaf of papers in a manila folder. "Just the formalities, Ellie." His voice was all business now, the performance of grief concluded. "The house goes to me, as per the updated will. The savings accounts, the investments. It's the most sensible arrangement. I can manage the assets properly." "Updated will?" Alara's voice was barely a whisper. "Last year, Dad was getting forgetful. He wanted to simplify things." Marcus avoided her eyes, focusing instead on a point over her shoulder. "He left you your personal effects, of course. And the bottomland plot. The deed's right here." He slid the paper from the folder. A quitclaim deed. Simple, final. 3 acres. Lot 7B. Known as the Pear Dump. Value, $475. It was an insult, gift wrapped in legal paper. She knew the main farm, the 100 acres of good pasture and timber, was worth a fortune. She knew Silas's savings were not insignificant. But she was tired. The grief was a heavy cloak, and she had no strength to fight. She took the pen he offered and signed her name. The river stone in her pocket felt impossibly heavy. The stripping away was methodical and swift. Marcus held an estate sale the following weekend. Ilara stood on the edge of the lawn and watched as strangers haggled over her grandmother's quilts, as men in greasy hats kicked the tires on Silas's ancient but perfectly maintained tractor. They sold his tools, the worn handles polished smooth by his grip. They sold his books, his records, the worn armchair where he'd read to her as a child. Each sold item was a small amputation. Cynthia, Marcus's wife, moved through the crowd with a cash box and a tight, triumphant smile. She offered Ilara a plate of limp sandwiches. "You should have something to eat," she'd said, her tone suggesting it was a great act of charity. Her father, David, was there. Ilara's father. Silas's son. He stood beside his brother Marcus, a shadow in a borrowed suit. He had been estranged from Silas for years, a wound Ilara never fully understood. Something to do with her grandmother leaving, and a fight that had echoed down through 2 decades. He watched the sale with a hollow look in his eyes, siding with the sensible brother, the one who knew about money, over the daughter who knew about the man. He didn't meet her gaze. His silence was the cruelest cut of all. When it was over, Marcus handed her a check for $2,312. Your share of the contents, after expenses. The expenses, she was sure, were astronomical. He had done it all by the book, the cruel, precise book of legal ownership that had nothing to do with love or inheritance. She was left with her sputtering pickup truck, a cardboard box containing a few of Silas's books on soil science he'd willed to her specifically, and the deed to a patch of worthless land. She had no job to go back to, having quit her position as a line cook to care for Silas in his final months. She had $94 in her checking account. She had the stone in her pocket, and she had the pear dump. She drove there as the sun was setting, casting long, mournful shadows across the valley. The track leading to the 3-acre parcel was little more than 2 ruts in the grass. The air changed as she got closer. The clean scent of hay and clover gave way to something else. A thick, complex perfume of decay. Sweetness and rot, the smell of fruit giving up its ghost. Piles of pears, some as big as softballs, lay in long mounds. They were in every stage of decomposition, some still golden but bruised, others collapsing into a brown, fragrant mush. Flies hummed in a dense, lazy cloud. In the center of the plot stood a barn. It was a ruin, or it looked like one. The siding was weathered to a silver gray, patched here and there with rusted sheets of tin. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired old horse. A single window, cloudy with grime, stared out like a blind eye. This, she thought, this is what's left, a monument to waste. She got out of the truck. The ground was soft under her boots. An old hound dog, with ribs showing and one clouded eye, rose stiffly from the shade of a mound of pears. It was Gus, Silas's dog. He'd been missing since the memorial. He watched her, then gave a single, weary thump of his tail. He had been waiting. For her. She walked to the barn. The main door, a huge sliding panel of weathered planks, was shut fast. A thick, rusted chain was looped through the handle, secured with a heavy padlock. Not Marcus's lock. This one was old, its iron pitted and dark. Silas's lock. Her heart beat a little faster. Why lock a ruin? She went back to her truck and retrieved the box of books. Taped to the inside cover of The Soul of Soil was a small, flat key. She had thought it was for a filing cabinet. Her hands trembled as she fit the key into the lock. It turned with a stubborn screech. The chain fell away, loud in the evening quiet. She put her shoulder to the door and pushed. It resisted, then groaned open on ancient rollers, revealing a sliver of darkness within. The smell that rolled out was not the smell of rot. It was sharp, clean, and alive. It smelled of apples and alcohol, of oak and thyme. It smelled of Silas's workshop. She slid the door open wider and stepped across the threshold. For a moment, she was blind. The interior was dim, lit only by the dusty light filtering through the grimy window and the cracks in the walls. But as her eyes adjusted, the shape of the room resolved itself. This was no ruin. This was a laboratory, a sanctuary, a cathedral of vinegar. Along one wall, great oak casks stood in a silent row, each stenciled with a pear variety and a year. Bartlett 2012, Comus 2015, Bosc 2018. They rested in custom-built cradles, gleaming as if polished that morning. On the opposite wall were shelves filled with glass carboys, demijohns, and strange, bubbling contraptions of tubes and airlocks. In the center of the room, a massive stainless steel tank, the kind used in small wineries, stood pristine. A workbench ran the length of the back wall, holding not derelict farm equipment, but hydrometers, pH testing strips, microscopes, and a neat rack of beakers and flasks. Everything was obsessively clean, obsessively organized. The floor, made of thick concrete, was sloped toward a central drain. The air, thick with the scent of acetic acid, was cool and still. He had built a false wall of weathered planks just inside the door, so that anyone peering through a crack would see only what looked like a derelict interior. It was a deception. A beautiful, breathtaking deception. This was his secret work. The bruised pears from the orchard weren't waste. They were the raw material. He had spent more than 3 decades here, in secret, perfecting a craft no one even knew he possessed on this scale. The occasional jar of vinegar he gave away was like a poet sharing a single line from an epic he was writing in secret. She saw it all in a flash of understanding. The endless hours, the patience, the quiet devotion. This wasn't a project, it was a life's work. It was a love letter written to a process. On the workbench, next to a microscope, lay a leather-bound ledger. It was worn at the edges, the cover softened with use. She opened it. The first page was dated September 1988. The handwriting was Silas's familiar, precise script. It began not with numbers, but with words. Isabel left today. The house is quiet. Too quiet. The pears are coming in at hemlocks, the bruised ones. They remind me of myself. Elara's breath caught in her throat. Isabel, her grandmother. She had vanished from their lives when Elara's father was just a teenager. The story was a whispered, shameful thing. She had run off with a traveling salesman. Silas had never spoken her name again, and he had started this on that very day. She turned the pages. It was a meticulous record of every batch of vinegar he had ever made. He recorded sugar levels, acidity, temperature, yeast strains. He wrote about the character of each pear variety. Bartlett ferments fast and hot, a teenager in a hurry. Bosc is sullen, takes its time, but has a deeper soul. He detailed the barrels, the type of wood, the level of toast. He experimented, he failed, he succeeded. He was not a hobbyist, he was a master. Woven between the technical data were personal reflections, short, stark sentences that chronicled a life of quiet grief. 1992. David won't speak to me. He blames me for her leaving. Maybe he's right. And then, a few years later, an entry that made her stop. 2006. Elara asked about the smell on my hands today. I told her it was the smell of patience. She understood. She found a small, locked metal box under the workbench. The key for it was on the same ring as the barn key. Inside were more notebooks, but these were different. They weren't about vinegar, they were about water. Silas had been taking samples from the creek that bordered the pear dump for years. He'd been testing them. The pages were filled with columns of figures, chemical notations, and dates. He'd correlated the data with the health of the trees at Hemlock's orchard. There were notes about increasing levels of specific neonicotinoids and glyphosate, pesticides that weren't used by Hemlock, but by the big corporate farms upstream. Agricorp, the same company that Marcus had mentioned, was buying up land in the valley. The bruising is worse every year, he wrote in an entry from the previous summer. It's not just handling, it's in the fruit itself, a weakness in the cell walls. The poison is slow, but it's steady. It's in the water, in the soil. It's in everything. He was building a case. This barn wasn't just a vinegar works, it was a secret environmental monitoring station. The vinegar was more than a passion, it was an act of defiance. He was turning their poison into his own, beautiful, sharp, incorruptible product. He was taking their broken fruit and making it strong. A shadow fell across the open doorway. Ilara looked up, startled. An old woman stood there, silhouetted against the evening light. She held a steaming thermos. "Knew you'd find your way here," she said. Her voice was like gravel and honey. It was Mrs. Gable, from the next farm over. Her land shared a fence line with the pear dump. "He said you were the only one who had the nose for it." She stepped inside, her eyes taking in the scene with a familiar ease. She was not surprised by what she saw. "Silas told me, years ago. Made me promise not to tell a soul. Said the world had no place for this kind of slow work anymore. Said men like his son Marcus would just see the board feet in the barrels." She poured a cup of coffee from the thermos and handed it to Ilara. It was black and strong. He was afraid they'd take it from him. Or worse, not understand it. He said it had to go to the one who understood worth, not price. She looked at Ilara, her gaze sharp and kind. "That's you, child." Gus the dog trotted in and lay down at Mrs. Gable's feet with a contented sigh. He was home. And in a way, Ilara felt she was, too. The grief for her grandfather was still there, a hollow ache in her chest, but it was now mingled with a fierce, protective pride. This was her inheritance. Not $475 of worthless land. This. All of this. The work, the secret, the fight. Over the next few days, a small community began to form around the barn. It started with Mrs. Gable, who brought food and stories. She told Ilara about Silas in the years after Isabel left, how he'd retreat to the barn for days at a time, a man rebuilding himself one batch of vinegar at a time. Then Mr. Hemlock appeared, his truck rattling down the lane. He didn't come to dump pears. He came with a crate of his best, unbruised fruit. "A gift," he said gruffly, "for the new master of the house." He looked around the barn, shaking his head in wonder. "I'll be damned, the old wizard." He offered to continue supplying her with the bruised fruit for free, just as he had for Silas. "It's better than letting it rot for nothing," he said. This is something." A retired cooper named Elias, a man with hands like gnarled oak, heard the news through the town grapevine and showed up one afternoon. He ran his palms over the barrels, murmuring their names like old friends. "Limousine oak," he said, tapping one of the casks. "He had me make this for him 20 years ago. Told me it was for a special project. Paid me in cash and 3 jars of the best damn vinegar I ever tasted." He offered to teach Ilara how to maintain them, how to repair the staves and keep them whole. They were the keepers of Silas's memory, a small circle of trust he had built over decades. They showed up not for money, but out of respect for the man and his craft. They brought their skills, their knowledge, their quiet support. They saw Ilara not as the disinherited girl, but as the rightful heir. With their help, she began to learn. She read Silas's journals every night, absorbing his philosophy, his techniques. During the day, she worked. She learned to use the hydrometer to measure the sugar content of the pear mash, or must. She learned to rack the perry, the fermented pear cider, from one vessel to another, leaving the dead yeast cells behind. She learned about the mother, the gelatinous, alien-looking biofilm of cellulose and acetic acid bacteria that was the living heart of the vinegar-making process. Silas had several mothers, each cultivated from a different source, each with its own character. He had one he'd started from an unpasteurized apple cider, another from a kombucha culture, and one, his oldest and most prized, that he'd simply allowed to form from the wild yeasts in the barn's air. She followed his instructions to the letter. She tasted everything. She learned the language of fermentation. The sweet, boozy smell of the initial ferment. the sharp, vinegary tang that followed as the acetobacter consumed the alcohol. The complex, mellow aromas that developed as the vinegar aged in the oak barrels, picking up notes of vanilla, clove, and smoke. Her hands, soft from her work in a kitchen, grew calloused. Her clothes were perpetually stained with pear juice. She felt more herself than she had in years. In one of the ledgers, tucked into a pocket at the back, she found a small, folded bundle of letters, tied with twine. They were from Isabel. They were postmarked from a town in Oregon, and they spanned 20 years. She had written to him. She hadn't just vanished. Ilara's hands shook as she read them. They were letters of apology, of explanation, of a woman who had been suffocating in a life that wasn't hers and had made a terrible, selfish choice to leave. She wrote of her regret, of her love for her son, of her hope that Silas could forgive her. And on the back of the last letter, in Silas's hand, was a single, heartbreaking sentence. "I forgive you. I just don't know how to tell our son." The family wound was not what she had thought. It wasn't about a flighty woman and a cuckolded man. It was about a man so broken by a grief he couldn't speak of that he let his son believe a lie for 20 years. He had retreated into his work, into his vinegar, because it was the only place he could transform something broken into something whole. The aphorism she had found in his main ledger now made a deeper, more painful sense. She found the page and read it again, her vision blurring. The good stuff takes its time. It finds its strength in what's been broken. He wasn't just talking about pears, he was talking about himself. One bright October afternoon, a sleek black sedan, completely out of place on the muddy track, pulled up to the barn. A man in a crisp suit and polished shoes got out. He had the easy, confident air of someone used to getting his way. Behind him, in the passenger seat, was her Uncle Marcus. "Ilara," Marcus said, his voice strained. He wouldn't look at her, focusing instead on a scuff on the visitor's shoe. "This is Mr. Thorne, from Agricorp. He'd like to speak with you." Mr. Thorne smiled, a flash of white teeth that didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Vance, a pleasure. We've been hearing about your enterprise." He gestured vaguely at the barn. "Quite the rustic operation you have here." He walked toward the open barn door, peering inside. His smile tightened. He had clearly expected a shack, not a state-of-the-art microvinery. "Impressive," he said, his tone flat. "My company is in the process of acquiring several parcels in this valley for a new distribution center. A major investment in the community. Your uncle has been very helpful in facilitating the sales." Marcus flushed, finally looking at her. "It's a great opportunity, Ellie, for the whole valley." "Your little plot here," Thorne continued, turning his back on the barn's interior as if it were of no consequence, "is right in the middle of our planned access road. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer, far above the assessed value. Let's say $50,000. For 3 acres of swamp and a derelict barn. It's more than fair." $50,000. It was a fortune to her. It would solve all her problems. But she looked past him, at the casks standing silent in the gloom. At Silas's meticulous workbench. This place wasn't for sale. "It's not a derelict barn," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Thorne chuckled. "Of course, it's a charming hobby, and we'd be happy to help you move your equipment. We could even throw in an extra $5,000 for your trouble." He was talking to her as if she were a child, a silly girl who needed to be placated. "The land isn't for sale," she said. Thorne's smile vanished. "Ms. Vance, perhaps you don't understand. This project is happening. It has the support of the county commissioners. We can, if necessary, pursue other avenues. Eminent domain, for instance. It would be a shame to see you get bogged down in legal fees and walk away with far less." It was a threat, wrapped in the language of concern. Ilara took a breath. She looked at the creek, glittering in the afternoon sun beyond the pear mounds. She thought of Silas's water samples, of the letters from a grandmother she'd never known. She thought of the slow poisoning of the land. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice still quiet, "how are the nitrate levels in the creek this season?" He went still. The confident mask fell away for just a second, revealing a flicker of pure, cold fury. He knew. He knew exactly what she was talking about. Marcus looked from Thorne to Alara, his expression one of utter confusion. "I don't know what you're talking about," Thorne said, recovering his composure. "My offer stands for 48 hours. Think it over." He turned and got back into his car without another word. Marcus lingered. "Ellie, what was that? What are you doing? This is a life-changing amount of money. Don't throw it away over some sentimental junk in a barn." "It's not junk," she said. "It's his life's work. And it's mine now." He stared at her, at the smudges of dirt on her face, the fierce set of her jaw. He didn't see a woman. He saw an obstacle. He shook his head in disgust and got in the car. The sedan spun its wheels in the mud before finding purchase and speeding away, leaving a trail of exhaust in the clean country air. You are perhaps thinking this is where the quiet girl folds. You are thinking the man in the expensive suit always wins, that the forces of money and power are inexorable, like a flood. You are thinking that $50,000 is a siren song that no one in her position could possibly resist. But you have not tasted the vinegar, and you do not know what it is made of. It is made of broken things, of slow time, of a quiet, unyielding refusal to be anything other than what it is. This is the part worth waiting for. The threat of eminent domain hung in the air for a week. A certified letter arrived from AgriCorp's legal department, full of clauses and statutes, a formal offer of $60,000, followed by a clear statement of their intent to petition the county for seizure of the property for the purpose of economic development. The letter gave her 30 days to respond. Alara felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She had no money for a lawyer. She had only the truth locked away in Silas's ledgers. She spent her nights poring over them, cross-referencing his water sample data with the dates of AgriCorp's land purchases upstream. A clear pattern emerged. As AgriCorp acquired and converted small family farms to industrial-scale monoculture, the levels of pesticide and fertilizer runoff in the creek skyrocketed. Silas had documented it all. He had photographs of algal blooms, of sick-looking fish, of the blight on the pear leaves. He had been building a case for years, but he had never used it. He had been too afraid of losing the one thing he had left. She found his last journal entry, written just 2 weeks before he died. His handwriting was shaky, the elegant script dissolving into a frail scrawl. Thorne's company bought the Miller place. That's the last buffer. Now they are my neighbors. They will find out about this place. They will try to take it. I have the proof to fight them, the data from the water. But I am an old man. I have already lost so much. I don't have another fight in me. I was broken. Maybe you can be strong. It was a baton being passed, a final request. He couldn't fight, but he had forged the sword for her. To choose the money would be to betray him. To fight would be to risk everything, to be crushed by a corporate machine. She held the smooth river stone in her hand, feeling its coolness, its solidity. She made her choice. She would not be broken. Her first call was not to a lawyer. It was to a woman whose name she'd found in Silas's notes, Dr. Anya Sharma, a professor of soil science at the State Agricultural College. Silas had corresponded with her, sending her coded questions about chemical signatures in groundwater. Alara packed up the ledgers, the water samples, and a bottle of her grandfather's 10-year-old Bosque pear vinegar, and drove the 2 hours to the university. Dr. Sharma was a sharp, energetic woman in her 50s with eyes that missed nothing. She listened to Alara's story without interruption, her expression shifting from professional curiosity to intense focus. She examined the ledgers, her eyebrows rising higher with each page she turned. "This is extraordinary," she said, her voice hushed with respect. "This is 2 decades of meticulous, unpaid, independent environmental monitoring. This is citizen science of the highest order." She took the water samples and the vinegar to her lab. A few days later, she called Alara. Her voice was grim. It's all here. The pesticide signatures in the water match the trace elements we found in the pears, and those same compounds are concentrated in the vinegar. Your grandfather wasn't just making vinegar, Ms. Vance. He was creating a chemical archive of the pollution. It's undeniable, and it's admissible. The public reckoning came at the county planning board meeting. The agenda item was AgriCorp's application for zoning variances for their proposed distribution center. The meeting hall was packed. AgriCorp had brought in a team of lawyers and engineers with glossy presentations about jobs and economic growth. Mr. Thorne sat in the front row, looking confident and relaxed. Marcus was there, ready to speak in favor of the project. He gave Alara a brief, pleading look as she entered. "Take the money," his eyes said. Many of the farmers whose land AgriCorp had bought were there too. They looked defeated, worn down by economic pressure and slick promises. They were there to watch the final nail being hammered into the coffin of their way of life. When the chairman called for public comment, Alara walked to the podium. She was terrified. Her hands shook. Her voice felt small in the big room. But she clutched the river stone in her pocket and took a deep breath. She did not begin with accusations. She began with a story. "My grandfather, Silas Vance, was a quiet man," she said. "My uncle told you all he was a man of simple hobbies. He was wrong." She looked directly at Marcus, whose face paled. "My grandfather was a master of a craft. He was a scientist, and he was a watchman." She laid it all out. She spoke of the barn, of the 34 years of secret work. She held up a bottle of the deep, amber vinegar for the board to see. "AgriCorp says this land is worthless, but it produces this. This is made from the pears they call waste, from the land they want to pave over." Then she presented the evidence. She didn't have glossy slides. She had Silas's hand-drawn charts, his dated photographs, his notebooks. She spoke about the rising levels of contaminants in the creek, using the chemical names Silas had so carefully recorded. She explained how the health of the orchards downstream was declining. She wasn't just defending her 3 acres, she was defending the whole valley. Thorne began to whisper angrily to his lawyer. The chairman of the board, a stern-faced farmer named Peterson, leaned forward, his expression intent. "These are serious allegations, Ms. Vance," Peterson said. "Do you have proof?" "I do," Alara said. And at that moment, Dr. Anya Sharma stood up from the back of the room. "I have the proof," Sharma said, her voice clear and authoritative. "I am Dr. Sharma from the State Agricultural College. I have personally analyzed Mr. Vance's data, his water samples, and the resulting product. His findings are scientifically sound and deeply troubling. AgriCorp's operations upstream are in violation of at least 3 state environmental protection statutes. The evidence is here, in my report." She placed a thick, bound document on the clerk's desk. The room erupted in murmurs. The farmers who had sold their land were looking at each other, a new, angry light in their eyes. They had been told their land was becoming less productive because of their own poor management. They had been lied to. Thorne stood up, his face a mask of outrage. "This is a preposterous slander, a fiction concocted by a sentimental girl and a renegade academic. We will sue for defamation." Alara looked at him. She was no longer afraid. "You can't sue the water, Mr. Thorne," she said. "You can't sue the pears. You can't sue this vinegar. It holds the truth of what you did." Chairman Peterson banged his gavel. "This board is tabling AgriCorp's application, pending a full investigation by the State Department of Environmental Quality. This meeting is adjourned." The aftermath was swift. The state investigation confirmed everything Silas and Dr. Sharma had documented. AgriCorp was hit with massive fines and a moratorium on any new development. Thorne was fired. The story was picked up by the regional news. The small-town girl who had saved a valley with her grandfather's vinegar. Marcus was publicly humiliated. He had been the local face of AgriCorp's expansion, the one who had convinced his neighbors to sell. He disappeared back to the city without a word. But a week after the meeting, a truck pulled into the lane by the barn. It was her father, David. He got out and stood there for a long moment, looking at the barn, at her. He looked older, smaller than she remembered. He didn't apologize. He didn't make excuses. He just walked over to a pile of lumber Silas had intended for repairing a section of the barn wall. He picked up a hammer and a saw. "Roof's looking a little weak in that corner," he said, his voice thick with unspoken things. And he began to work. He came back every weekend after that. He and Ilara worked in silence at first, a comfortable quiet that was more honest than any words of regret could have been. They repaired the roof. They replaced the rotten siding. They built new shelves. He was a carpenter, she remembered, a good one. He was rebuilding the barn, and with each nail he hammered, he was rebuilding the bridge to his daughter, to the memory of his father. One day, while they were sharing a thermos of coffee, he finally spoke of it. "I was angry at him for so long," he said, staring into his cup. "For letting her go. For never talking about it. I thought he was weak. I sided with Marcus because Marcus seemed strong. All about business, numbers. I was wrong. Dad's strength. It was here all along. It was just quiet." Ilara reached into her pocket and pulled out the bundle of Isabel's letters. She handed them to him. He read them, his face crumbling as the lie he had lived with for 30 years fell away. He wept. And when he was done, they were no longer a broken family held together by secrets, but two people starting to heal. With the thread of Agricorp gone, Ilara threw herself into the work. She was not just a keeper of the legacy, she was its future. She bottled the first commercial batch of vinegar, naming it Silas's Folly. The label was simple, featuring a drawing of a bruised pear and the words, "Made from what is discarded." She took it to the local farmer's market. At first, people were skeptical. The vinegar was expensive. It was dark, unfiltered, with a mother floating in some bottles. But she offered samples. People tasted it. Their eyes would widen. It was unlike any vinegar they had ever had. It was complex, with layers of fruit and wood, and a clean, sharp finish that lingered on the palate. It tasted of the place it came from. It tasted of time itself. She sold out in 2 hours. The next week, the line at her stall was 20 people deep before the market even opened. Chefs from restaurants in the city started calling. A specialty food distributor wanted to carry her product nationwide. Silas's Folly became a quiet sensation, a testament to the idea that worth had nothing to do with price, and that the best things were not mass-produced, but coaxed into being with patience and love. She hired Mrs. Gable to help with the bottling. Mrs. Gable's granddaughter, a bright 13-year-old named Lily, started hanging around the barn, fascinated by the process. Ilara began teaching her, just as Silas had taught her, showing her how to test the acidity, how to listen to the whisper of the fermentation, how to respect the living thing that was the mother. The legacy was passing to another generation. One spring morning, she and her father drove 100 miles to the town in Oregon from the postmarks on Isabel's letters. They found her grave in a small, windswept cemetery overlooking the ocean. The headstone was simple, Isabel Vance, beloved. They stood there for a long time, the silence broken only by the cry of gulls. Ilara took the smooth river stone from her pocket, the one Silas had held for 34 years. She placed it on top of the headstone, a final, quiet act of forgiveness. The wound was closed. Dusk was falling as she walked back to the barn that evening. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and the promise of new leaves. A warm light glowed from the barn window. Inside, her father was finishing the last of the repairs, his movements slow and sure. Gus thumped his tail on the porch, a faithful guardian. The rows of barrels stood like silent, sleeping monks in the dim light. She ran a hand over the rough oak of the 2012 Bartlett, the first cask Silas had filled after she, as a child, had asked him about the smell of patience. She was home. The noise of the world, the clamor for more, for faster, for cheaper, could not reach her here. This was a place of transformation, a place of slow, deliberate alchemy. She looked out over the valley, the lights of the small farms twinkling on in the twilight, a landscape she had saved. She breathed in the sharp, sweet air of her inheritance and whispered her grandfather's words into the quiet. The good stuff takes its time. It finds its strength in what's been broken.